I have a confession to make. Preaching on Mother's Day is difficult for me. And I have managed to successfully avoid it for several years now until Dr. Mark asked me. I wasn't going to say no, but I have been doing lots of praying since that assignment was given me. For a few years, I managed to successfully avoid preaching on Mother's Day because the church where I was serving as senior pastor, church in Cleveland Heights, well, they decided to have Children and Youth Sunday on Mother's Day. No sermon. The congregation loved it, so it was a win-win. But 3 years ago, just about a month before Mother's Day, quite unexpectedly, my eldest son died. And suddenly I could put a name to my avoidance of preaching on that day. But I know that my discomfort began long before that. It evolved through my years of ministry as I became more aware every year that for all the joys of this day, for so many families, it can also be among the most difficult of days for others. Now, in my first call as an associate pastor, I was serving a very rapidly growing new church start in the suburbs of Indianapolis. And my staff assignment as an associate pastor was to start a weekday ministries program, a preschool. And the program was so successful that within just a couple of years, that program was welcoming 300 families each week. And those families who had just purchased homes in this very new upscale neighborhood, well, it was also a time in their lives when they were looking for a church. And what better place to try out on a Sunday morning than a place where your children are loved and welcomed and comfortable during the week? And so the church grew as the preschool program grew. And largely, I'm sure well into the 90 percentile, those families in that program were nuclear families, two parents, two highly educated parents, and those young children were already being given every advantage in their lives. And I'll admit that it was very easy to assume that Mother's Day was an across-the-board happy for everyone. And I'll confess that it was far too easy to overlook those for whom it was not. Now, after my ordination and when I became the senior pastor of an urban church, and then I moved to Cleveland Heights, and the demographics of those congregations were quite different. And long story short, I grew in my awareness of how this day can feel for people who weren't parented well, or people who suffered abuse and neglect, or situations where mothers had so recently died, or tragically died, or prematurely died. Women who had suffered infertility issues. Women who had had abortions. Or children who were estranged from their parents after coming out to their families, or parents whose children moved away and never looked back and don't stay in touch. Oh, there are so many layers to this day. Or as in my case, women who all of a sudden are part of a group that no one would ever join willingly. Those who have outlived one of their children. Now, I'm sure that I am hypersensitive to all of this. But my prayer for all preachers this morning is that they will be sensitive to both how good this day can feel, and it does, and it can feel so very good, but also how much it can hurt for others. Others who come but are silent in their discomfort, and maybe the tears will start this afternoon, or others who intentionally stay away from feeling uncomfortable in other years. But even with that, Mother's Day, well, it's a very highly attended service in most churches. Often it comes in third behind Christmas and Easter, because it's the Sunday that moms can get all their kids, even the most reluctant of children, to church with them. It's the Sunday that moms and grandmas beam with pride when our church kids are reading or they're singing. Many of us remember the days, maybe when it was a tough day at home with our own kids, but we could come to church and we'd be invited to stand up and be recognized and be handed our carnation. And others just want church to be over with today because you want to get to brunch. You know, that very elegant and perhaps overpriced brunch that you're going to go to on Mother's Day, where mom will rightfully be seated at the head of the table wearing that beautiful corsage that you got for her. So it is my privilege to be bringing you this message on such a special day in a beautiful sanctuary filled with all of us who are mothers and all of us who were birthed by mothers. And to ask ourselves the question, so what would Jesus do with this day? Well, I don't know exactly, because the official recognition of this day didn't happen until in the 20th century, but I do know that Jesus had quite a lot to say to parents and about parents. More than once, Jesus said that we are to honor our parents, as we are told in the commandments. But there are also some really tough passages in Scripture about parents. You know, like the time that Jesus said, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother cannot be my disciple." Or the time that Jesus said, "There is no one who has left house or wife or brothers or parents or children for the sake of the kingdom of God who will not get back very much more in this age and in the age to come." Or the time when a prospective disciple asked Jesus if he could follow him, and he said, "Jesus, I will be right back. I promise to follow you, but I first have to bury my father." And Jesus said, "Let the dead bury the dead." I mean, is Jesus really telling us that we have to deny home and spouse and siblings and parents and children and property to follow him? There must be an easier way. And even though I may be a little conflicted about a happy Mother's Day, I just couldn't go there this morning. That's too tough. There are too many layers in all of that. It's too murky. So instead, I chose a related subject about which Jesus is much more clear. Children. Making this day about children of mothers leads us to ask different questions, like how did Jesus feel about children? What example did Jesus model for us? Well, we heard two of them this morning. And oh my, beautiful images come to mind of Jesus cradling a child in his arms. But there's so much more to this than just Jesus being warm and fuzzy. This isn't like a selfie that's circulating on social media. This isn't a political candidate holding a child saying, "See, I like children, and children like me." There's so much more to this, because this was radical. This was such a radical act that our 21st century selves just can't even fathom how radical. Because in Jesus' time, children were among the least valued, most vulnerable. Children were essentially non-persons. They would not have been allowed to approach a teacher of Jesus' status. They would not have been allowed in the company of those men. They would have needed to be with the women who also were not welcome in the presence of those men. And that was what the disciples were trying to point out to Jesus. He seemed to have not a clue about these cultural do's and don'ts. And then for Jesus to suggest, even remotely, that this child had something of value to offer to these male disciples, it was inconceivable. These men of some privilege, they're arguing over who would be the greatest representative of Jesus, and then they are put in their place and displaced by this small someone who was previously invisible to them. A child. A child. A beloved child, we would say. Because we've come a long way in our valuing of children. I was reminiscing this week with a pastor friend of mine about how special beyond words it is when you're a pastor and you get to go make a visit in a hospital and you get to hold a child who's less than 24 hours old. There's just nothing better in ministry. You get to hold that child and you get to offer a prayer of blessing, of health and life over her, and you pray for sleep for her exhausted parents. Now, interestingly, my friend and I were having this conversation at a baby blessing service. Now, it was a baby blessing service unlike any other I have attended. It was held at the Cleveland Clinic Chapel. And during this worship service, we took markers and we traced our handprints. And then we signed those handprints and we wrote a message, each of us did, to this young girl child that she will read at some point in her life. We all sang "This Little Light of Mine." And then we gathered around these parents and this child, and we laid hands on them. Much like an ordination service. And this mother is ordained, but rather than following her tradition that would baptize her young child, she is a mom who believes that her daughter should make up her own mind about how and when and if she will be baptized. That's how valued this child is in that family. That child is valued above tradition. And if we were time travelers and we were just dropped into this story in Mark, we would be scandalized by the treatment of children. We who will do everything within our power to protect our children, to provide every advantage for them, to give them choices, to build up their self-worth, and to provide for them an endless stream of photos on Instagram that will show every facial expression they've had before the age of 3. We cannot imagine. We just cannot imagine hearts so hardened as the disciples that day that they wouldn't just melt when they saw Jesus hold that child. Because this just might be Jesus' easiest lesson for us. Well, before we give ourselves too much credit for our enlightened awareness of children, I think we need to look beyond our own families and realize that not a lot has changed for far too many children in our world. Some children are still invisible. Some children are vulnerable and do not have protection. Who are our throwaway children today? Are they the children who are growing up in Cleveland in houses that have chipping and peeling lead paint, and that lead paint dust is all throughout their houses, and their lead poisoning is going to affect them negatively for the rest of their lives. Who's invisible to us? Are they the 94,000 children who are food insecure right here in Cuyahoga County? That's 1 in 5 children who do not get enough to eat on any day of the week. Are they the more than half of our city's kids, 54%, who live in poverty, the second highest rate of any big city in our country? Do we ever think about the daily stress that those kids endure? Those conditions of poverty that will take a huge toll on their mental and physical health, and that cycle will continue throughout their adult lives and perhaps their children's lives, and all of that leads to in the inability to hold a job or finish an education or to be incarcerated or to become addicted. We're becoming all too aware that every day brings another tragic death due to opioids. And though certainly not all those deaths are young, each was a child of his parents, and each a child of God. And all of this must matter to us. It must. Because that child that Jesus held in his arms was not his child. The child that Jesus held in his arms was not the son or the daughter of a proud disciple standing close by. If Jesus were to time travel to us in the 21st century, perhaps his message to us might be something like, good, you enlightened and well-informed people and sophisticated about the care of children. Good for you. Glad you got that right. But what are you going to do for this child I hold in my arms? Now, I wasn't here at Old Stone with you for a few Sundays recently. We were traveling more than usual in late April and early May. There was one weekend in the middle of all of that. There was a huge celebration in our family when David's son graduated med school. Summa cum laude, I will brag on behalf of his proud father. But there were weeks on either side of that huge family celebration. One was in Chicago, one was in Washington, D.C. When we were in Chicago, we were attending a conference put on by the Episcopal Bishops Against Gun Violence. The event was titled The Unholy Trinity: The Intersection of Gun Violence, Racism, and Poverty, arguing that you cannot separate any one of those out. And I'm still trying to absorb all that we heard and learned that weekend, but we heard moving testimony the first evening from a young man who had been shot near his home on the south side of Chicago, very near where our conference was on the University of Chicago campus. And his injuries that night were thought to be severe enough to have cost him his life. But for the excellent care provided by the dedicated, compassionate, if exhausted, staff at a Cook County hospital, and if not for teachers willing to go the extra mile with him, he not only survived. This young man is graduating high school and on his way to Southern Illinois University later this summer. Now, at the same conference, the following night, we were having dinner at a Hyde Park neighborhood restaurant. It was just 3 of us. We were sort of debriefing the day, and it was the 3 of us who had traveled from Cleveland to this conference, those of us who are part of our local organization here, God Before Guns. And 2 of us had on our God Before Guns shirts, and if you've not seen them, they're just this obnoxious bright orange with our logo across the chest. And near the end of the meal, a woman approached our table. She'd seen our shirts, I'm sure, and she probably overheard some of our conversation. She asked if she could sit down, and she started telling her story. She said, I live right here in the neighborhood. I live on Obama's Street, she said. We've lived here for 12 years. She was a 40-something white woman who said they intentionally bought their home in this racially diverse neighborhood because that's how she wanted her children to grow up. But through tears, she said, but I can't live here anymore. I'm calling the real estate agent. We're going to sell. We're going to move away. Last night, the gunshots started, and they didn't stop. I made my children go down to the basement because bullets can't penetrate concrete walls. Now, don't get me wrong, she said. I feel very sad for the mother whose gang member son died. And I also mourn his loss, the loss of his young life. But my job is to keep my children safe. You understand that, don't you? Absolutely, we understood that. Of course I want her family to be safe. And she was blessed with the resources to be able to move away from that violence. But our prayer at the table had to be about the many parents in that same neighborhood who did not have the resources to move away. They want their children to be safe as well. They have to stay because they have no place else to go. I want their children to grow up to maturity. We must want that for all children. The child Jesus held in his arms was not his child. Now, the next week, we were in Washington, D.C., and we were in the halls of Congress, but I'm not going to say anything about that. But we were at a conference hosted by the Brady Campaign and Americans for Responsible Solutions. That's Gabby Gifford's group. And we heard more testimony there. We heard personal testimony from a young woman whose mother was one of 3 persons killed in a mall shooting in Portland, Oregon. She was a teenager when she lost her mother so tragically. Now she's an organizer for one of these organizations. She's putting her grief into positive action. And then there was another mother, Sally Phillips is her name. Her daughter was killed in the Aurora theater shooting. Do you remember that? There was a midnight showing of the latest Batman movie. 12 were killed. Sandy is a tireless crusader so that no one else must suffer the same loss that she did. Sandy's actually going to be here tomorrow night. She's going to be in Brecksville. If you want details, I've got them. If we don't stand up for children, then we don't stand for much. Those are the words of Marion Wright Edelman, but I hear Jesus in them. In his sermon last week, Dr. Mark asked us to take time to listen for Jesus' voice. Our dear shepherd Jesus, to listen for his voice, for only in listening for his voice will we be able to follow where he is guiding us. Well, sometimes Jesus' voice comes to us in very small voices, in the voices of children. And we must listen. And we must respond to the small voices that are calling out for our attention. Now, this day, Mother's Day, reminds us that none of us are perfect mothers. But if we're honest with ourselves, it also reminds us that we've not always been perfect children, even when our mothers were doing the very best they could. Good thing there is such a thing as grace. God's grace that forgives us and gives us another chance. Mother's Day. Mother's Day gives us a chance to celebrate our less than perfect attempts that somehow have still managed to generate enough of that imperfect love to nurture our children through their lifetimes. We know that it is only God who can love perfectly. The only perfect mother is our mother in God. Julian of Norwich in the 14th century described our mother God with this trinity. She said, the first is the foundation of our nature's creation. The second is God's taking on of our nature, where the motherhood of grace begins. And the third is that motherhood at work, and it is all one love. It is from that one love that Jesus challenges us to extend our familial love out into the world, to extend that love to all children, and as children of God who yearn to be welcomed ourselves. One of my favorite poets, Pablo Neruda, writes this. He says, to feel the intimacy of family is a marvelous thing in life. To feel the love of people whom we love is a fire that feeds our life. But to feel the affection that comes from those whom we do not know, from those unknown to us, those who are watching over our sleep and solitude, watching over our dangers and our weaknesses, that is something even still greater and more beautiful, because it widens out the boundaries of our being and unites all living things. And that is my prayer this morning for each of us, that we will experience every bit of that love as both those who receive it and those who give it. For then we will have worked to build a world that has taken Jesus' example and made it our own. Amen.